This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to the Right and Left Discussion Forum. Before we begin, I would like just to take a moment to pay tribute to Nelson Mandela, who passed away yesterday. Mr. Mandela was the strongest proponent of civilized problem solving in our generation, and he is a role model for the efforts of right and left. Rest in peace, Mandela. The purpose of our discussion is to demonstrate that people with different political views can deal with contentious topics in a civilized manner, much in the way Mr. Mandela did. We believe that the progress of our communities and our country hinges to a great degree on how much we care about what other people think. We know that while beating down someone else's point of view may provide a certain primitive satisfaction, it does nothing to advance our common cause of effective self-government. Today our topic is capital punishment, and our panel, beginning on my left, is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired research chemist. On his left is not Jerry Ritzman, but that's what I was prepared to say. On his left is Bryan Laubaugh, who is the president of R&B Financial Services. And on his left is Patty Haskins, Democratic member of the Wadsworth City Council. And finally, Jerry Ritzman, partner in Ritzman Natural Health Pharmacies. We'll begin our conversation with Ron Chamberlin. Ron, there have been arguments for and against capital punishment probably since Cain slew Abel, and I know that you've got some well thought out opinions on this subject and would like for you to share them with us.
Thank you, John. As I begin thinking about this and identifying what I think are the things, are the various aspects of this, I harken back to what one of our panelists said in the last session. Tim, he says much of what he feels and what I feel, I know, comes from your background and the emotional response to that background, not necessarily on reason. However, there are reasonable arguments for and against. There are conservative point of view, the sort of retentionists, people who would keep the capital punishment, and are the abolitionists. Bryan, I have to warn you, I'm an abolitionist. But you probably figured that.
Sure.
One of the publications that come to the House at this time of year with all these solicitations is one from an organization that calls themselves National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And they gave a little snapshot for the end of 2013. 18 states do not have the death penalty. 29 states have not carried out an execution in the last 5 years. And 143 innocent people have been freed from death row. We'll talk more about that later. Mm-hmm. Well, I found a website called Pro and Con. I don't know if it's .con or .org, but they had a listing of things, and I found them after I developed my own list. But here are the aspects I'm thinking about that bear on this. There's the financial aspect. People say we could save a great deal of money, and there are statistics to back this up and some projections to back this up. If we spend $5 billion to execute people, we could save $10 or $15 billion not executing people, but keep them life without parole. There are other people who say, well, those numbers are inflated. As a criticism of that, justice should not be determined by finances, for or against. Mm-hmm. There's the religious aspect. Judaic law, Mosaic law, says thou shalt not kill. But a Hebrew scholar that I knew in Connecticut, a rabbi, says the word kill in this instance is a Hebrew word that means murder. So that all of the Ten Commandments and most of the Leviticus legal stipulations involved with keeping the community together. Doesn't keep protecting it against outside influences. Certainly the Hebrews had no qualms about going into Canaan and killing off as many inhabitants as they could to take over the property. And that's been true throughout history in most of the religious organizations, except possibly the Buddhists, who have a slightly different view of life. The Buddhists and the Hindus, to some extent, when your belief in in a reincarnation, a wheel of life coming along, all that life is sacred, particularly, and it carries to some extremes. But so there's the deterrence. Well, I've got a statistic here that Texas, Texas had something like 405 executions. They have over 1/3 of the executions. However, they still have several hundred people on death row. So the criminals aren't getting the message. So there's some doubt as to whether the death penalty is any more of a deterrent than life in prison. And for folks who have visited prisons, and our church has a pen pal who's in prison, maybe life in prison for those people who are vindictive about this is just as bad as being executed. It's not a nice life. There's the ethical and philosophical. John Locke, the philosopher, says that a killer forfeits his right to his natural right to live. So therefore, we have every obligation, and Immanuel Kant says we have the moral and ethical obligation to take that life, if that life has been taken. However, that's the code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye and a life for life. We don't really, if a person rapes, we don't rape that person. If a person robs, we don't steal from that person. If a person kills, should we kill that person? Or is this not a revision to the code of Hammurabi many, many hundreds of years ago? Should we not be more civilized than that? Mistakes. I just quoted that statistic. Several hundred people have been exonerated from death row by evidence of DNA or what have you. So, I'll get professorial here for a moment.
Okay.
I'll try to keep you brief. Retribution. Death penalty is deserved and ultimately balance the scales of justice. Retention is a conservative view. Criticism. Justice demands that murders be punished. A literal eye for eye is not an acceptable means of punishment in civilized society. We're not Saudi Arabia. We're not a number of African countries. We're in bad case there. Incapacitation keeps the murderers from killing again. But murderers sometimes aren't repeat killers. Just maybe we overestimate that danger. Deterrence, financial cost. The liberal position would say that it's proposed arbitrarily. It's not proportional to the either to the either to the population or to the type of crime that's being committed. Many states have proportionality reviews to check that this was that. Executing the innocent. The criminal justice system isn't perfect. It may be one of the best in the world, but Mark Twain had some nasty things to say about the jury system. And people, I know I saw a quote recently that people are smart, people are intelligent, people are capable of rational decision. Individual people in general, are a little bit more stupid, can be swayed in various ways.
That's been obvious in the last couple elections.
Oh, hasn't it been, though? Racial bias. It's imposed. There's a racial bias imposed in here. The real bias seems to be against white killers who typically kill whites. Blacks who kill blacks are not held quite as responsible. Blacks who kill whites are held very responsible. International standards. Most industrialized countries around the world, with the exception of us, have abolished the death penalty. Well, is there a compromise possible there? Maybe not. Abolitionists are absolutists in a way. But perhaps maybe we have to have maybe the Supreme Court to set limits on proportionality so that only the really, truly guilty would be sentenced. No racial bias. I don't know how you do that, but this quote I was looking for. Texas in 2007 was responsible for more than 60% of all executions in the U.S. Other southern states are also heavy users of the death penalty. Maybe this to try to bring these states more in line with the national averages. Is that a reason? Is that a grounds for compromise for the absolutists? Perhaps.
To satisfy statistics.
Satisfy statistics.
Okay. Oh, excuse me.
I'm finished for now.
I'm struggling with the seasonal flu here, I guess. Oh, Bryan, I know that it's draining at the range.
Yeah, well, I went to some of those websites, and a lot of the stuff, it sounded to me that came off the ACLU website when it came to some of the statistics and everything. And I think the focus that these organizations that propose to do away with the death penalty, they focus on the criminal as the victim. And that's where I differentiate this, is that the criminal, in most cases, is not the victim. There has been a victim, and that victim is either dead or so terribly maimed that that person has been, that the assailant and the perpetrator of this crime has worked their way through a legal system that is painfully, the process is so painful that it takes years and years and years to have anyone have the sentence of capital punishment taken place, that, it's years, and, the 100 and so, 147 or so, or somewhere in the 1 or 2% of those that are on death row that are actually found innocent. So are there some areas that can be tightened up in the system? Yes. I look at this from the side of the victim. And Ron reminds me of a story that I just recently read that I thought, to me, puts a pretty decent picture on the type of individual that I think would deserve the death penalty. The victim, who was Jim Gifford, was a little over 70 years old. He had walked to his local convenience store for the last 20 years to buy a cup of coffee and his local newspaper. One Saturday morning at about 6 o'clock, he's walking out of the store. He passes a group of youth. One of the youth turns around and hits him in the back of the head, knocking him down, and then starts to kick him in the head for no apparent reason. Jim, like Ron, was sort of like the meek and lowly. He never bothered anybody. He volunteered at his church. He was an ideal neighbor. He was just the perfect citizen in his community. The youth went in and did their victory dance in the local convenience store, and all this was caught on tape. The youth that perpetrated it went back out and stomped on Jim's head until his friends came out and pulled him off of him, and they ran off. Now, this young man that did this had been in and out of the judicial system, had been in jail any number of times for assault and battery, burglaries, gun charges, you name it. He had a list a mile long, as well as his juvenile record had been sealed because they didn't want that to prejudice his adult crimes. This is the system that we live in. Jim died 2 days later as a result of those. Now, you tell me that young man, all of this caught on tape, I don't care if he's black, white, or Asian, doesn't deserve the stiffest possible penalty, because to me that's heinous. And when we let people like that go into prison and come back out after 10 or 15 years, I think that is a crime in and of itself. So I take this more of on an emotional basis, because I wouldn't want to see someone like Ron walking out of the local convenience store, attacked and killed for no reason. And we sit back and say, well, what's the problem here? What's the problem with this young man? I think that those types of crimes and the crimes that these people have committed that rise to the level of capital punishment, we should fulfill that consequence and go through the process. I'm not for shortening the appeal process or anything, but once you get 10, 15 years out and you can't prove your innocence and you're on death row, I think the sentence should be carried out. And so that's where I fall on it.
The only caveat on that is I would say, instead of death penalty, life without parole. The 10 or 15 years out, I don't agree with that either.
Yeah, I just think there are certain heinous crimes that rise to the level of capital punishment. And when we focus on that criminal as the victim, which I really don't think he is at that point in time, him or her, that we focus on what they've done, to who they've done it to, and the people that they've affected. Jim Gifford's family now has to live, his children live with that for no reason whatsoever, his life was taken in a cruel and unusual manner. To me, and I'm sure there are plenty of other stories for victims, and so that's why I fall on the side of the victims of these crimes, and I don't consider the criminals victims in this case.
Patty, before you begin your comments, can I start with a question?
Oh, sure, by all means.
Bryan has introduced the idea of emotion into this whole process, and certainly that is a dominant theme throughout any discussion of capital punishment.
Absolutely.
And tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Well, as far as emotion, I know, and having in years past having discussions about capital punishment with my family, and I was always opposed, and I'm still opposed to it. And they said, well, what if it was your daughter or your son or your mother or your father? And that's where the emotion comes in.
That's why you're not allowed to be on the jury in that case.
Exactly. But one of the things I think we have to consider is what is the purpose of our whole judicial system, and as far as our laws and for punishing criminals. I mean, our purpose obviously is to punish that person who has committed a crime, perhaps to rehabilitate them, and mainly to make sure that they do not commit that crime again, which obviously I think can be accomplished by life without parole in the case of a murderer. I think when we get to the case where we insist upon the death penalty as punishment, that our motive then changes to revenge, that we want to get back at that person for having taken the life of that person who committed the crime. So that's a big concern of mine. Another thing I have to look at is, and Ron had touched on this, is the fact that there are too many people that are innocent, that are convicted of murder, and are sitting on death row or have died. At present, the United States is one of the few democratic countries that still allows the death penalty. The death penalty is allowed in most Asian countries and here, but if you look at European nations and other democratic nations, they've disallowed it. I believe it was in England that it was stopped in 1950, and correct me if I'm wrong, and it was due to the fact that they found that a gentleman was killed by execution, and they found out afterwards that he was alive. And I think that having the death penalty does not allow for the death of that innocent person, and we have to be concerned with that.
Well, I'm sure that the story about the person in England who was executed and later found alive is going to be interesting to
That's what I said. Innocent, thank you. Oh, innocent. I said oh my
We
goodness.
interpolated that.
Yeah.
We're taping this at an early time this morning, so that's my excuse.
Jerry, can you give us your thoughts?
Sure, I've gone 360 or 180 a couple different times in my thought process. I received a conscientious objector status in the draft because I told the draft board I don't think anybody has the right to take anybody else's life, whether it be in civil or in a wartime, and received that exemption. And I thought that way until the early 90s, when there was that instance over near Rolling Acres Mall where two guys threw bricks or something off a highway overpass. The two girls stopped in the car and they murdered and threw them in the woods. And I examined that case closely and I thought, there is no way, in my opinion at that time, that these two guys could be rehabilitated. They were they had no conscience. And so I thought in those cases I would be in favor of the death penalty. I've changed my mind again. I'm not in favor of the death penalty. Just because there are a bunch of European countries that don't have it, that doesn't mean that we should do away with it.
That's true.
And Bryan, that young man that you recounted in the story, he is not beyond redemption. I'm not saying we should let him out in public, but I don't believe in the long run that that person is beyond redemption, given the right circumstances. And I know that there are innocent people who are on death row, and there have been a number of people who have been, their convictions have been overturned due to DNA evidence. That's a topic for another time. I have a little problem with that because of there are a lot of scientific principles in the past that were taken as solid, unchanging truths or unchanging principles that have found out to be later, such as matter cannot be created or destroyed, and then there was an addendum put to that. So, but that's a topic for another time. But no, I am not in favor of the death penalty because I don't think anybody is beyond redemption, and I think that life in prison may be the solution for those crimes that are that heinous.
Without parole.
without
And
parole.
even if only a few % of people are on death row who are innocent, they're still people.
Yeah,
That's
and-
right.
and-
It's too
and-
many.
and I
And there are
think-
probably
yeah.
still a bunch of people
Yeah.
out there who are not in prison who are guilty. So we're human.
Yeah.
Juries are human.
Exactly, and we are all human, and the fact is that, there's been hundreds of years of precedent with capital punishment, and Ron, you cited some, the biblical sources and things of that nature, and I'm all for redemption. I'm all for individuals having the right to change, whether it's in this life or the life to come, is really up to, what they've done in this life, as far as I'm concerned. But I look at this not from a revenge, but justice.
Right.
Justice. We believe, we have that, the lady that is blindfolded, that the statue, that she is on some courthouses and stuff, and there's the scales of justice. And when you look at these situations, I think that there just are certain crimes, heinous crimes, that rise to the level of capital punishment. You can go over to Norway, and that young man that took out 26 unarmed, helpless youth. He'll be out, he'll be walking the streets in, what was it, Finland and Norway? They only believe in 10 years or 12 years. And to me, that just, I hope that they can redeem that young man within that 10-year period of time, but I think that's a train wreck waiting to happen again. So I don't believe in the revenge aspect of it.
No.
I'm not saying that my emotion is about revenge, the eye for the eye, but I think there are certain heinous crimes that rise to the level of capital punishment, and you deserve to have that consequence met out.
You talk about, justice, and we have to, it's almost an indictment of the justice system. When you look at the number of people that have been convicted and sentenced to death, they skew towards the poor who have not had or had the ability to obtain the best legal counsel. In many cases, if you're rich enough, and we've seen this, you can commit murder and get away with it, not just avoid the death penalty. And unfortunately, when you have a judicial system that has that flaw within it, that's a whole other topic, how to improve that situation, to then place a death penalty as your ultimate charge, I find that difficult to deal with, so that, it's okay to kill this person, but not this person. And
Well, that's a flaw in the system.
Yeah.
Fix the flaw. If you're going to have someone come up on a capital offense, then you lawyer him up with the best representation that you can afford. And a lot of times you're going against the state, who, obviously, the lawyers are a dime a dozen when it comes to the state. And so, fix that flaw. If there's a discrepancy as far as poverty or race or whatever, stack the deck for that individual and let him run the course through the system. But I think the system is so painfully slow, and these appeal processes that take years and years. And there might be a small percentage of those death row people that are innocent, and they're certainly having their opportunity to prove their innocence over a long period of time.
I guess over the years, the biggest argument I've always heard for the death penalty was that it deters someone from committing crime. It helps the prosecutor because they can, get someone to admit to having committed the crime if they take the death penalty off the table. There's absolutely no proof that it is a deterrent to crime.
And there's some powerful evidence that it isn't.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I looked up some data, and the states that have the death penalty have a much higher murder rate than the states that don't have a death penalty.
There's an anecdote in Old England when hanging was a punishment for thievery and being a pickpocket. Generally, pickpockets found that the crowd witnessing hangings as fertile grounds for practicing the trade.
That's an unintended consequence.
Somehow they were getting messy. But I think the flaw in the system, for my point of view, is that we are going to allow us to kill, the state to kill another person. That's the flaw.
Bottom line.
We just did it with Osama bin Laden.
Of
We
course.
sent some of our most skilled and trained operators, and Osama bin Laden I guess through the court of public opinion and our ability as the United States, decided that he didn't deserve to live, because I don't believe there was an effort to bring him back, because I think they could have. But, you know, we do it all the time. When Mr. Obama sends over a drone and takes out 3 or 4 leaders of Hezbollah or 3 or 4 leaders of the Taliban, that's capital punishment, as far as I'm concerned. So we have to run it both ways now. You know, if we're going to look at it that way, then, you know, all the things we do with drones and all the things we do with our you know, our operators that are, you know, that are out there protecting us, then we have to look at that as well.
So I've been anti-war and a peace advocate
There
and
you
a
go.
pacifist since
Yeah.
at least 1970.
Yeah.
Jerry, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If you had the choice on Osama bin Laden to either take him out, kill him, or bring him back to the United States for trial, which one would you have picked?
Oh, I would have brought him back.
Even though knowing that a long extended trial is going to do nothing but fuel the insurgency and the Taliban's ability to recruit new terrorists.
I still would be in favor of bringing him back. It may not be the most efficient way to end the problem, but it probably, in my opinion, would be the thing to do.
I think when, I just want to make a couple of comments here before we run out of time. When you look at the religions that came out of Abraham, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, that there's an awful lot of ambiguity in there. You cannot put a stake in the ground for any one of them being for and against, which is a difficult thing. As a Christian myself, I struggle with the idea that even Richard Cooey, who was on death row for the murder that you're talking about, and Jeffrey Dahmer, and some others, that God loves them just as much as he loves me. Now, it rankles me to think that from time to time, but well, thank you very much for a very good discussion. And I would like to leave our audience with a couple of quotes to consider. We would like to leave this quote first. "Criminals do not die by the hands of the law, but by the hands of other men." That was George Bernard Shaw. This one from one of my favorite late-night hosts, Steve Allen. "If the Old Testament were a reliable guide to the matter of capital punishment, half the people in the United States would have to be killed tomorrow." Thank you very much for a good discussion, and thank you for joining us.